So, how does knowing Tolkien's gods help us better understand the story of The Hobbit and the story of Scripture? Hi, my name is Dr. Jordan Koss, and this is the Millennial Harbinger channel. This past spring semester, I read The Hobbit for the first time because I was teaching my seventh grade students The Hobbit. And for all of those students, the 60 or so seventh grade students I had, none of them had read The Hobbit before. And I don't even think any of them had read any of Tolkien's material before. I really hadn't either. I never read The Hobbit, and I didn't read The Lord of the Rings. I had listened to, in preparation to teach The Hobbit, the Silmarillion on YouTube. But as I was reading through The Hobbit and teaching it, I noticed some really cool things I wanted to share with you in this video. And one of those is in the beginning and end of the book, there's only two references to Sauron, who's called the Necromancer within the story of The Hobbit, right? And so in the first chapter and in the last chapter, he's referred to as a necromancer, and he's not mentioned anywhere else in the rest of the story. Nor are there any other specific mentions of any of the other gods that I can think of as I was reading through in the story of The Hobbit. There's not even I don't believe a specific mentioning of the name of the creator god in Tolkien's world, which is Eru Ilúvatar. And it would appear that they don't play much of a role in the story as a result of not getting any airtime, if you will. But that's not the case. Um, because, for one thing, um, let's see here. For one thing, the whole story is about getting rid of Smaug the dragon. All right, so why is that significant? Well, the origin of dragons in the First Age were made by Morgoth, who was the rebel Ainur, the strongest of the Valar, who fought on his side to conquer Middle Earth. So, in the First Age, Morgoth fashioned a bunch of different, like, nasty creatures in order to defeat the race of men, the race of elves, the race of dwarves, right, and take over Middle Earth, and dragons were one of them. Now, Smaug wasn't one of those original dragons, but he was the descendant of some of those original dragons, and he was one of the last, if you will, I think, great dragons, fire-breathing dragons in Tolkien's world in Middle Earth. Okay, and so references to Sauron and Morgoth via the reason to kill Smaug, via the reason to retake the Lonely Mountain and the lost kingdom and city of Erebor, only makes sense within this greater legendarium within which the Hobbit actually falls within, right? And once we understand this broader context, which begins with the Silmarillion, which takes us from creation to the Third Age, and then ends with the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which happens right after the story of The Hobbit, and the Lord of the Rings trilogy picks up in 3018 to 3019 of the Third Age. And so, in order to fully understand what's going on in The Hobbit and also see how big of a role the gods in Tolkien's world play within the story of The Hobbit, we must look at this greater legendarium, greater context, and greater story. And then once we understand that, and perhaps understand this council of gods that Tolkien has created for Middle Earth, it'll help us see them in the story of The Hobbit and how big of a role they actually do play. And so, um, you have to understand, like I just mentioned, Tolkien's cosmology in order to understand The Hobbit. And Tolkien's cosmology, on top of that, actually has some really cool parallels with what Dr. Michael Heiser calls the divine council worldview in the Bible, right? And so here is a very brief rundown picture of how this council is set up by Tolkien for Middle Earth. You have Ilúvatar, or Eru Ilúvatar, the creator god of Tolkien's Middle Earth, Tolkien's world, right? And then this creator god, he then creates what are called the Ainur, what we might think of as angels, right? Spiritual beings. He creates the Ainur, and the Ainur are broken up into two different categories. You have the Valar and you have the Maiar. Now, Morgoth, the Satan figure in Tolkien's Middle Earth world that he has created, He's one of, if not the strongest of the Valar, and he decides to rebel after being created. He actually rebels in the midst of creation. And then the Maiar there's a bunch of them. Some are named, some are not. But Gandalf just so happens to be one of those Maiar within the story that we see being taking place within The Hobbit. And so to kind of show you go a little bit deeper in terms of the Valar, there's 15 of them, and there's an equal number of men and women. Like the only one who doesn't have a female counterpart wife is Melkor, later named Morgoth, or vice versa. He goes by those two specific names. But the brother of Melkor actually is Manwë, and he's kind of like also the last or the strongest of the faithful Valar, if you will. And he's also the one who sends Gandalf and the other Istari to Middle-earth, to where they become incarnate, to help the races of men and elves and dwarves defeat Morgoth and save Middle-earth, right? And so this is just a snapshot of the 15 Valar, of Tolkien's kind of divine council that he has of Middle-earth. All right, and here's a further deep dive into who creates whom in Tolkien's setup here, in Tolkien's cosmology. We have Eru Ilúvatar, the creator god, who creates the race of men and the race of elves, and hobbits are related to men. They don't have a separate kind of creation story. They just descend from the race of men. And then you have Manwë, who creates the eagles within the story. Aule, who creates dwarves. He kind of like Aule kind of does something he shouldn't do, and he's like, I want to go ahead and create these guys. And Eru Ilúvatar, once Aule creates them, ends up giving them the flame imperishable, or life, and the dwarves become living beings like the race of men and elves. And then you have Melkor, or Morgoth, who takes some of what has been created. Often that's at least one of the main views of where these other creatures come from. Morgoth twists what has been created and creates dragons and trolls and orcs, kind of like in an anti-Eru Ilúvatar, anti-god sort of way. And Morgoth uses them as his force, his army of darkness, if you will, to overtake Middle Earth. But there you see both Gandalf, Radagast, the Blue Wizards, and Saruman. Those are the five Astari, who are Maiar, who were sent to Earth to help the race of men and elves. And Saruman actually rebels himself and joins the forces of Morgoth and Sauron. And Balrogs are also former Maiar who rebelled. And then you have Sauron himself, the main villain of the Lord of the Rings trilogy and The Hobbit. He is actually a rebel Maiar himself, which is really cool. And when you kind of understand this setup, man, it really opens up what's actually happening within The Hobbit, especially if you're reading it for the first time, and helps you read better, especially. Now, here's a basic breakdown of how understanding the gods of Tolkien will help us, and where we can see the parallels, especially with Scripture, the story of Scripture. You have faithful Valar and Maiar. Example, Manwë. He is the villain. And then you have, Manwë is not the villain. He's the strongest remaining Valar, faithful Valar. And then you have Gandalf, who's a Maiar sent to Earth, incarnate, to again assist the race of men, elves, and dwarves. They war against the rebel Valar and Maiar, and the primary examples are Morgoth, Melkor, the strongest of the Valar who rebelled, and then Sauron himself, who was a Maiar who rebelled and joined forces of Morgoth. Okay? And so, as you read through The Hobbit, here's some of the references to the gods that you might not pick up initially. Okay? So you have the necromancer, or Sauron, the Satan figure Maiar, which we've already mentioned. He brackets the story of The Hobbit. Smaug, we've already mentioned, which is an indirect reference to Morgoth, the overall Satan figure Valar. And you've got Gandalf, who again, an incarnated Maiar, one of five who were sent to Middle-earth to assist the races of men, elves, and dwarves against Morgoth. The eagles, we've kind of seen already how they were beings crafted by the Valar Manwë, the strongest of the remaining Valar, faithful Valar. And then also a big theme, at least I saw throughout reading The Hobbit, was fire. The flame imperishable, which Eru Ilúvatar uses to create the world, is wielded by Gandalf himself as being sent to Middle-earth via Manwë, and therefore we could assume via the good graces of Eru Ilúvatar. And Gandalf uses that power given to him by Manwë and Eru Ilúvatar to help, again, assist in the defeat of Morgoth. Okay, so real quick, how can we take that understanding of the gods of Tolkien's world of Middle-earth and see parallels with the story of Scripture and what's going on from Genesis all the way through Revelation? So here's one way you could put it in light of, again, Dr. Heiser's Deuteronomy 32 worldview. You have the 70 or 72 nations mentioned in Genesis 10, whether you're reading the Hebrew text or the Septuagint. You have those nations mentioned in Genesis 10. They are assigned to particular created gods to rule them. Okay? The nations are assigned to those Elohim, and those Elohim rule over them as a consequence of humanity's consistent idolatry, which culminated at the Tower of Babel story in Genesis 11, where Yahweh then chooses Abram to create a new people to be his nation to rule over, right? Israel will come from Abram, and he will use that new nation to come from Abram, that he is their God, right? He will use that new nation to ultimately lead, the intent is, right, to ultimately lead every nation back to himself that he divorced after the Tower of Babel story. All right, so there's Genesis 10 and 11. That's one. Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel story, is the first of four main texts in Heiser's Deuteronomy 32 worldview. The main text in his Deuteronomy 32 worldview is this one, verses 8 and 9, Deuteronomy 32, where the Most High gave the nations their inheritance. The Most High is Yahweh. All right. When he divided all mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. Sons of God, there are the Elohim, the created supernatural beings, spiritual beings that serve Yahweh up in the heavenly realm, if you will. For the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is his allotted inheritance. So Deuteronomy 32, 8, 9 harkens back to what Yahweh did there after the story of the Tower of Babel, when God divorced the nations and then chose Abram to make a new nation out of him. And so the what Heiser talks about is the conflict moving forward is Yahweh and his people against the rebel gods that he set over the nations and those nations. Because as we see in the third main text in Heiser's Deuteronomy 32 worldview, those gods, those sons of God, those spiritual beings he set over the nations rebelled in their purpose, in their work, in their duty that Yahweh gave them. And they rebelled against Yahweh, like Morgoth and Sauron rebelled against Eru Ilúvatar in Tolkien's Middle-earth. Psalm 82 says God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. How long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked? I said, you are gods, you are all sons of the Most High, but you will die like mere mortals. You will fall like every other ruler. Rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations are your inheritance. Psalm 82, verses 1 and 2, 6 through 8. So, as we see there, this is exactly the place where, in the Hebraic Christian supernatural worldview, God's created beings of the heavenly realm decided to, in one instance at least, the ones he set over the nations, decide to rebel against Yahweh. Instead of pointing the nations back to Yahweh, they pointed the nations to worship themselves, to commit idolatry towards them. All right, and here's the fourth main text, Deuteronomy 4, verse 19. There's more verses in this general area, but I chose to stick look at verse 19 itself, where it says, "And when you look up to the sky and see the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the heavenly array or the heavenly hosts, do not be enticed into bowing down to them and worshiping things the Lord your God has apportioned to all the nations under heaven. And here we see the sun, the moon, and stars are just another image or metaphor used to refer to the supernatural beings, the spiritual beings that were created on day 4, where that original image is used of them in day 4. They were the hosts of heaven created, in the heavenly realm, whereas human beings, man and woman, Adam and Eve, if you will, human imagers, were made on day 6 to serve God and rule in the earthly realm. All right. But here, God via Moses is telling the people of Israel, don't worship them. All right. Worship me alone because I am the Most High, right? I am the Creator God and not them. But as we know, the story of Scripture shows us Israel continually worshiping the gods of the nations instead of Yahweh, the Most High. All right. So, what can we say? After looking at those 4 main passages, we can say something like this. God's promise is for us to be like the stars, Abraham's children and offspring to be like the stars, not so much in terms of quantity, but in quality. It's not a quantitative promise, it's a qualitative promise, as I've heard spoken before by another scholar. I think David Burnett is his name, who I heard first that from. Okay, so God's promise is for us to be like those stars, i.e., the ones created on day 4, Genesis 1. And Jesus, the bright morning star that we see in Revelation 22, the last page of the Bible, gives us, as faithful Christians, the star himself. He promises one of the 7 churches of Asia there in Revelation either 2 or 3. Hey, if you withstand and are faithful, you will receive the star, which an aspect of that promise and that reception of the stars to rule, if you will, so that human imagers will rule in the council again, along with Jesus and the faithful sons of God, replacing the sun, moon, and stars who rebelled, like those set over the nations, like Satan, like any other supernatural spiritual being that has rebelled against God, like demons, like the ones that Jesus encountered in his ministry in the Gospels, right? And then human imagers, along with the faithful sons of God, and Jesus shall rule over all of creation, the cosmos, for all of eternity in this new divine council. At least that's the picture presented to us. And that's the picture presented to us, especially a whole lot better by Dr. Michael Heiser himself in his books and his videos and in his podcast. Okay, so reading Tolkien will make you a better Bible reader. And reading the Bible, like reading Tolkien, will help you see the supernatural setup in Scripture a whole lot more readily. All right, so those are 2 things we can kind of wrap up with. What's something else? Well, Tolkien's Council of Valar and Maiar parallels the divine council of the Hebraic Christian worldview, right? This Judeo-Christian worldview we see going on from Genesis to Revelation, where we have faithful spiritual beings fighting a cosmic war against their fellow rebellious spiritual beings, which directly impacts those living on Earth and Middle Earth, right? Both those things are happening in both stories, in The Hobbit and in the story of Scripture, okay? And one final thing, though, that I want to end with, which I think is a good point to make before ending this video, and that's this. The problem is, we just like when we read The Hobbit, we don't initially realize these gods and these gods at war and this cosmic warfare going on. And thus we miss the grander meaning, the grander context to which to understand the Hobbit in Scripture. And we read the Bible the same way and simply miss much of that greater story, greater context. All right. And so, much like the Hobbit, so Scripture. The better we understand the supernatural backdrop of Middle Earth that Tolkien first elaborated, let's say, in the Silmarillion, but he wrote The Hobbit first. But the Silmarillion came by, I think, posthumously. And reading that, wow, that was like a very cool kind of like realization. After reading The Hobbit, yes, but once you see what's going on in the Silmarillion and how that helps you understand what's going on in The Hobbit, it's like, whoa, that's so cool. And so what Heiser does for us, much like the Silmarillion and realizing the divine council of the Middle Earth, Kaiser helps us see the council of gods and this cosmic warfare going on in Scripture, and it really opens up so much to understand what is happening in the story of Israel, what's happening, and why Jesus, who Jesus is, why he's doing what he's doing, etc., in the story of Scripture. So, guys, I really hope that you enjoyed this video. I enjoyed making it. Go ahead and go check out The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy and the Silmarillion. You can actually listen to the Silmarillion for free on YouTube. It's a lot easier listening to it than it is reading it. I hear, and I've personally experienced myself. But guys, thanks for watching all the way to the end. We will see you next time. See you later.